Okay, hello, and welcome to week 6. This week we are going to be talking about sex, gender, and sexuality. So let's start here. Let's get the big thing out of the way. Science is not nature. And I want to start there because so much of what we are socialized to believe and understand about the relationship between sex, gender, and sexuality has been provided to us by scientists over the last 100 years and preserved and repeated in a way that suggests that scientists who write these theories, who do this research, much like myself, are, what's the word that I'm looking for? Detached from the lived society in which we exist. And by that I mean, I'm a scientist. I understand how the social sciences work, how to study them, how to analyze them, how to write about them. But that doesn't mean that I am also not a member of society and have been socialized in ways that I don't recognize readily every single day. This is an important thing to remember that socialization is this perfect process. And when we say that it's a perfect process, what we mean is that nobody is exempt from it. Everybody in society is socialized, and the boundaries around sex, gender, and sexuality are a really good example of the pervasiveness of um, the way that we think about and understand these things as people, not just arbiters of science. So the first thing that we need to talk about is this idea of bodies versus dichotomies. So much of what we think about and understand when we talk about sex and gender is rooted in these pre-formed dichotomies. For sex, it is male, female, and that is specifically about your biology. What organs do you have? What hormones and chromosomes do you have? And then we have gender, which is about the performance that extends out from your sex identity or your sex designation. And that is usually boy, girl, man, woman, or masculine or feminine. But you notice that as I did those are all happening in pairs. Dichotomy simply just means two categories. And what we have done and what we as the collective continue to do perpetually is to reify those boundaries around these two categories and not allow a lot of thought and conversation to go into what other categories might exist. Um, but the world doesn't work in dichotomies. And just because we want it to be constricted to these very tight little categories, that doesn't mean that that's actually how people are going to engage with it. And so rather than think in dichotomies, we should think about the role of an individual's body in their decisions about gender identity, which is how they perceive themselves, gender expression, which is the performance of the gender that they would like to be perceived as, their biological sex. Again, we talked about that as organs and hormones and chromosomes, and their sexual orientation, which is about who they are attracted to. So, how do we get here? We talked about socialization earlier, and there is a specific process of gender socialization where we are learning the attitudes and behaviors associated with an individual's particular physical appearance, usually discussed around the dichotomous relationship of masculinity and femininity, right? So, what behaviors are socially acceptable and expected to perform this femininity or masculinity. And again, that goes back to the relationship between gender identity, gender expression, and biological sex. Sexual orientation doesn't actually have much to do with sex or gender. We just expect it to. And we'll talk a little bit about more about that in a second. What I mean when I say all of this, to sort of boil it down to one sentence, sex and gender are socially constructed. And what that means, and the reason that we know that it's socially constructed is because sex and gender identities, available categories, varies over time. It varies by place, it varies by culture. For example, in many Native American cultures, there are 4 categories of gender. In some, there are 3, where the third category is two-spirit, to suggest a multi-gendered, I guess is a better way to think about it, multi-gendered individual. And they are learned, shared, and enforced, and eventually taken for granted, which, remember, are the sort of 4 pillars of the socialization process, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So if sex and gender are socially constructed, then there is a process for individuals and groups of individuals to become gendered, to embody these gender roles, those attitudes and behaviors that we talked about earlier as being expected. And we participate in gendered institutions which reify those labels. And many of us buy into a gendered belief system, which perpetuates the ideology that gender and sex differences in the manner of these dual categories are true and real. So let me give you an example. Bathrooms. Some of you that have been here a little bit longer than others may remember that a couple of years ago, there was a big push by a group of students and the Institute for Inclusion, I believe, to move to gender neutral bathrooms on campus. And it was a relatively big deal, and there was a lot of public discussion about it. Bathrooms are one very explicit way that we create, perpetuate, and reify sex and gender as 2 category systems across American society, right? So if you can only use the bathroom in public if you identify as either a male or a female, and can successfully, to the comfort level of others you may be sharing the bathroom with, perform the gender identity associated with that sex, only then can you safely use public restrooms. Well, that ignores a couple of things. That one, in your home, there are no discussions about what gender or sex identity you are to use a bathroom. I assume that those of you who grew up in homes where there were mixed sexes and mixed genders all used the same bathrooms. And that's because we sort of think of the home as safe. And, this is our family, and so it's okay. But that ignores that when we are in public bathrooms, we are just as likely to be attacked or mugged or raped by someone else in the same bathroom compared to someone coming from another bathroom, or someone from a gender identity, or who performs a gender identity that is not in line with that bathroom's category. People are violent everywhere, regardless of which bathroom they use, though it should be noted, and we'll get into this when we get to the deviance and crime section, white males between the ages of 18 and 25 commit more crimes in this country than any other group. So if we're going to be afraid of anybody in public spaces, those should be the people that we are afraid of. But because we have couched this idea about gendered bathrooms around this gendered belief system, that there is something true and real about the differences between individuals based on sex and gender that are not socially constructed and that are purely biological, and that put you in some sort of danger such that you have to maintain these boundaries, then you would buy into that belief, right? Because it's being perpetuated your whole life. That's how you have seen bathrooms in public. Your parents tell you not to talk to strangers in the bathroom, and that has to do with this gendered belief system. When I got to Vassar College as an undergrad, one of the first things that was shocking to me was that the dorms were co-ed, room to room, which meant that if you were, it didn't matter where you were, unless you were in the one all-women's dorm, you would be sharing a bathroom and showers and toilets with men. And as someone who grew up in a home of three women, I was not prepared for that. Again, not because I had some explicit understanding about men and women sharing separate bathrooms, but that I had bought into this gendered belief system that that's simply the way that it was supposed to be. And if it wasn't that way, then this was a sort of a weird and unique situation. But you know what? You get over it pretty quickly. And when I was there, and this was in the early 2000s, before anybody was really talking about gender neutral bathrooms in public discourse, most of our bathrooms were gender neutral. And that was only a problem one weekend a year, Parents' Weekend, when family and friends came and they had not been re socialized into this institutional environment, which allowed for a gender neutrality that you generally don't see in the public. Now, that was almost 20 years ago. We are seeing things change as they are changing here on Ursinus campus. But it's a really good way to understand the process of becoming gendered, right? We often talk about, well, you're born and they wrap you in a pink blanket or a blue blanket, and you get Barbies versus G.I. Joes or whatever. Yes, absolutely. That is also part of the process of becoming gendered. But there's also smaller, more nebulous things that you don't always think about that are working in tandem in this process of gendering us and continuing to perpetuate our gender identity to the public. Um, your family, and by extension, cultural and group membership, are the sort of primary agents of gender socialization in this case. And there are a couple of theories about social identity which we can use to understand how this works. So, for example, labeling theory. Labeling theory is the idea that if you give someone a label and use it enough, then that person will buy into that label and start to exhibit the attributes of that particular group. That's really what we're doing from the moment people are having gender reveal parties that are burning down acres of forest in California, right? That's about the initial moment of labeling. And then you use the blue blankets and the pink blankets, and then you create the room, the nursery that is sort of explicitly a boys' room or a girls' room, or you have the baby's ears pierced to denote female versus male, right? You buy them particular toys, particular clothes, and so on and so forth, with the hope that if you call them that thing enough times, they will internalize it and understand themselves as having that, in this case, gender identity. The looking glass self is a theory by a social psychologist by the name of Charles Horton Cooley, and it is the idea that the way that we understand ourselves is based on how we think other people see us. So, not how we know because they've told us, but the perceptions that we have about how other people see us, and therefore we think of ourselves that way, right? So, if I believe that you think of me as feminine, then I'm also going to think of myself as feminine. And by contrast, if I think that you think of me as masculine, then I'm going to think about myself as masculine by extension. And then hopefully, if we add the self-fulfilling prophecy theory onto this, I will continue to tell myself that I am masculine, and I will eventually perform those behaviors that are typically associated with and acceptable for the performance of masculinity in American society. And the way that we come up with all of these perceptions that lead us down this road of becoming gendered via the people around us are through this idea of role models, right? We talked about role models we talked about roles a couple of weeks ago, and how they are this set of behavioral expectations that we learn to engage in to maintain cultural or group membership. Well, when we talk about gender and sex, we look to people to help us understand, they're reference groups in a lot of ways, right? To help us understand how we successfully enact these roles and engage in these performances. I've been talking about this as though it's very pick and choose. And as we become more understanding of the ways in which sex, gender, and sexuality are socially constructed, there are more avenues and open and more space for people to do some picking and choosing. But I want to be clear that there is a normalization of these dichotomous category systems around sex and gender explicitly that are normalized via medicalization. So if we go back to bodies, right, and biological sex being about organs and chromosomes and hormones, we have to also understand that bodies do not fit neatly into this two category male female system. Not everybody has those sort of typical sets of organs, chromosomes, and hormones that we associate with being a man or being a woman. But doctors for 100 years or so have been using their medical privilege to reify these boundaries. And up until about 2000, many doctors were given the go ahead via the papers that you sign when you go into the hospital to complete surgery on newborn babies to make sure that their chromosomes and their hormones match their outward body. Now, this became problematic and got into the news and is now illegal. Parents must be notified, although parents, because they are often a part of that gendered belief system, end up okaying these things anyway. But because there was a lawsuit, or there were lots of lawsuits, doctors can't do this on their own direction anymore, because what was happening was that intersex people, and that's that's the word that we use to describe people whose organs, chromosomes, and hormones don't fit neatly into this two category sex gender system that we've created. And there are millions of intersex people in the United States. But they were going through puberty, and their gender identity and their gender expression no longer fit the sex categories that they had been designated as a child. And then they found out that surgery had been done, and they had been changed without any consultation, and that this was the particular result. Those decisions are often made by penis size, again, even for newborn babies, because even though babies don't have any idea about sexualization or gender or the role of this particular organ in those performances, that we have this idea that, well, oh, that penis is too small, it's going to be a problem, and so let's amputate it and raise that child as a girl. Well, those sorts of decisions are being made every day to perpetuate this idea that bodies fit neatly into socially constructed categories, which would never be the case. But people buy into this, and the gendered belief system is rooted in the understanding that sex and gender are hegemonic. And when we talk about hegemonic or hegemony, which is another form of that particular word, what we're talking about is how pervasive something is in society, so much so that you don't even notice it's happening. So we talked about the bathrooms. In this example, this is from about 10, 12 years ago now. I think she's a teenager, but this was about Shiloh Jolie Pitt, the firstborn child of Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, who at an early age started to perform a gender identity and a gender expression that was not explicitly female or girl or feminine, and people started asking questions about if the Brad and Angelina were turning her into a boy, right? And the reason that these magazines and news outlets can talk about this stuff so explicitly and unironically is because we've come to understand, even for little children, that gender identity and gender expression must happen a particular way. Otherwise, they're not normal, and that needs to be discussed. This means that gender dictates everything we do. It dictates what we eat. You can see here the his and hers pizzas, the his and hers subs. If you go to a lot of restaurants, they'll have those sort of dinner for twos or his and hers that stipulate the lighter meal for the woman, the heavier meal for the man. Here it's veggies versus meat, right? It also dictates how you live. Here we have an example of a she shed versus a man cave, right? Even the idea that you need to have these explicit spaces by gender and that those spaces have to look a particular way because all women or all men engage in the kinds of behaviors that would mean that this style was good for them, limits everybody, and creates this sense that these things are neat and tidy categories. So sex and gender are socially constructed. I think I said earlier, sexuality is also constructed. It is, we want to believe that sex and gender and sexuality tie neatly together. But in reality, those things actually have very little to do with one another. They don't have to have anything to do with one another. And the fact that they do for many people speaks to the perfect process of socialization that we talked about a little bit earlier. What we do need to understand about sexuality, much like sex and gender, is that it is organized around hegemonic masculinity, right? Who what are behaviors that you consider to be masculine? Those are the baseline. That is what we expect from all men. And then women, by extension, perform femininity as a foil of masculinity. And in that way, women or people who do not identify as men, I should say, have structurally less power and less say in the entire system of sex, gender, and sexuality compared to men, and in particular, white men. Okay, I am going to leave you with that today. There is no active learning exercise for this week. Take a break, get some rest, come ready to discuss sex, gender, and sexuality in discussion, and I'll see you then. Bye bye.